I'm Ryan Pack.
And I'm Nicole Barlow.
And this is Soundtrack Your Life, where we talk to a guest about a soundtrack that they feel connected to. Today we have Courtney E Smith, one of the hosts of the Songs My Ex Ruined podcast. She's also a writer for Eater in Dallas, and she wrote the book Record Collecting for Girls, Unleashing Your Inner Music Nerd One Album at a Time. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. This is definitely a specialty area of discussion of mine.
So for our listeners who don't know about Songs My Ex Ruined, why don't you tell them a little bit about that podcast?
Yeah, it's a podcast where we have a guest on every week, and they very simply tell us the story of a relationship that went down in flames and a song that went with it, something that reminds them of that. And it is depressing sometimes and sometimes hilarious. You never know what you're going to get. It's a real mixed bag out there with people's romantic lives.
We've had a mutual guest. You had Rachel Brodsky.
That's right.
She's a friend of the podcast here as well.
Yep. Rachel is a great music writer who is a friend of mine too.
Oh, and I plan on plugging Stereo Gum, which he writes for in this episode, because one of the songs from this soundtrack that we're going to talk about reached #1 on the Billboard charts, but we'll get to that in a minute. So today we are going to talk about the 1994 Ben Stiller film Reality Bites. So Courtney, why are we talking about Reality Bites?
Well, this movie was pretty seminal for me. I grew up in the 90s. I'm from Texas. I'm from near Houston. And when it came out, I was like, oh yeah, this is the future I have to look forward to. I was not quite in college yet when this movie came out, but I was in high school. And it resonated with me. There's literally a dress Winona Ryder wears from the Gap that I have, that I wore. So I had the soundtrack on CD. I was obsessed with it. And it was always interesting to me because it was a Gen X movie without being a grunge movie. And that felt very Texas. And it felt really authentic to not only people that age, but the place that it was supposed to be in, and the time and the way that we talked and the way that we thought and felt. And the music was all over the place. Like, it was very mainstream. A lot of it wasn't even from the 90s. And the stuff that was really indie was stuff I was just discovering. Like, I found Juliana Hatfield because of this movie. I'd never heard of her before. So it made a big impression on me, and it pushed my music taste in a direction here and there.
Do you still have the dress from the Gap? I have to know.
No, unfortunately, no. But I do still have photos. Do still have photos of myself in it.
All right, we might have to put that on the IG or something, just for our listeners, if you want to dig up that photo. I feel like you could flip that on Depop. So
oh, absolutely. I wish I had it. It's not the lace doily dress either. Sorry.
No, that's the one I was thinking.
No, it's the brick red flowered one that's like a button down dress.
Okay, yeah. So this movie features quite a few references to the Gap and a lot of big gulps.
A lot of big gulps.
So weird admission is I felt like I had seen this movie. I was very confident I had seen this movie, and as I was researching this week, I started to realize that I actually had never seen Reality Bites.
What? Really?
The posters like burned into my memory, and I was like, Ben Affleck is in this, right? And I'm like, no. And then I was like, wait, Richard Linklater didn't direct this?
No. That's another Texan. You're
Yeah.
in the ballpark.
maybe Ethan Hawke is confusing the issue for Ryan.
Yeah, so I think, because Ethan Hawke was in it, I just assumed it was a Linklater movie, and then I saw Dazed and Confused and just assumed they were the same thing. You both said in Texas, and both having to do with like the end of the school year, kind of. But so yeah, it was kind of this weird sort of revelation, like, oh wait, I have never seen this movie.
Wow.
Well, I think our elder millennial status puts us in a really weird period of time for the popularity of this movie, because for us, I think it was less about the cultural touchstones of the film itself and the storytelling, because that wasn't really relatable if you were, 12 or 13. But it was relatable because it was blasted all over MTV. The strength of the lead single, which is Stay by Lisa Loeb, that you only hear in the credits of this film, by the way. It's not actually in the film, which I thought it was. In my head, I'm like, it's definitely somewhere in there, right? It's in that like pivotal moment at the end where Ethan Hawke and Winona Ryder are pining for each other. No, it's not in the film. It's credits for the film. And not to, lead with Stay, but it's the lead single, so we might as well talk about it, right? I think the present popularity of that song and how long it fucking lasted. I remember as like a preteen and teen having that on so many freaking mixtapes.
Hmm.
Every slumber party and birthday party and weird sing along with your girlfriends. That was a big deal.
Oh yeah, I made my parents get me the CD after that when it came out, which was after this movie because she didn't have an album.
Right. So, important note here, programming note, Lisa Loeb did not have an album when they chose this song to be on the soundtrack. Lisa Loeb was Ethan Hawke's neighbor
That's right.
in New York, so like
That's right.
somewhere on Mercer Street. They were neighbors. He knew her. He passed the tape to Ben Stiller, who directed Reality Bites, and the rest is sort of history. So, like, you can go into like a whole oral history of Just Stay.
So, as a Texan who moved to New York after college, like that pipeline is real and also resonated with me. And every Texan in New York seemed to know each other. Like you find each other and you flock together. It's a like weird intra-community thing. So that all tracks, like that he would go to bat for her, that he would like her music once they were in each other's orbit. That's kind of what we do. It's a weird cultural thing. It was very strong in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah, and he even tried to have her write a song for him in the movie. The song he performs with his band before he does the Violent Femmes cover.
Mm-hmm.
He had asked her to write it, and she wrote a demo, and it just ended up not being accepted. So he pushed hard for her to be involved with this film. He's a bit of a tastemaker. I think he directed a film a few years later called Chelsea Walls, and he had Jeff Tweedy score that before Wilco really kind of became a huge band in America.
So here's what I always found really interesting about that is that it's a woman, like Lisa Loeb is a woman, and men usually recommend other men, especially in the 90s, for this kind of stuff. It could have easily been just some indie band that Ethan Hawke wanted to be friends with that he like did this push for and put all of his cachet behind, and it wasn't. And just like you said, same for me. Like her songs are all about very from a woman's point of view about relationships and relational issues and feeling alone, feeling insecure, feeling vulnerable. That stuff was like another lane in the 90s, the Lilith Fair era, when women could be very angry or women could be confessional singer-songwriters, and those were the only real two paths to success. But as an angsty teen, I resonated with both of those. They were both very appealing to me. And that's a big part of why beyond Stay, Lisa Loeb, I have a lot of songs. Like I memorized that whole first album. I loved it all. But I have thought for a long time that there's something interesting about how much people attribute her success to Ethan Hawke or bring that up every time they talk about her. And why he would have done that is interesting to me, but also why it has to be something that she carries around 30 years later. This was 1994, like almost 30 years later, is also interesting and institutionalized way to discuss her.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I didn't know any of this history behind why that song was chosen for the movie before I started researching for this podcast. To me, it was still a really great time to be, as you said, like an angsty teen girl. And to me, this really kind of weirdo left field, not traditional songcraft, chorus verse type of single in Stay is a testament to her. And it's a testament to the strength of the song and, her ability as a singer-songwriter. I don't think that it would have happened without her. It's not something that, there's no engine behind it. There's no intentionality behind it. It just hit. It hit at the right time and people felt it, and it resonated long after the movie was a thing.
Mhm.
Long after the movie had like left theaters and left consciousness. Stayed.
Yeah, and I heard that they didn't even really pick it as a single. They just kind of sent the soundtrack to different radio stations and let the programmers kind of take whatever they wanted from it. They weren't sending out a single of Stay. It just ended up being the song that resonated with these different radio stations. And it's as organic of a moment as everything now is so manufactured. Like, you can't have a Stay in 2023.
Yeah.
Like, it was like viral before viral.
It's the beauty of the 90s. The other interesting fact about Stay that I found is that she had originally written it for someone else. She had seen that Daryl Hall from Hall & Oates had a solo album coming out, and she submitted it to him, and it didn't happen. And thank God it freaking didn't, because how weird would that be? I don't think anybody would want to hear this song from Daryl Hall. It just wouldn't be the same.
In the 90s, I don't think anybody wanted to hear from Daryl Hall at all.
Like at all, right? Like there wasn't even like the notion of whatever like ironic yacht rock in
that was not a thing yet.
Would have been it would have completely died on the vine. So happy ending for that track.
But it is like there's something poetic about what became the lead single for this movie being a woman's voice. I mean, it mirrors the lead character being Lainey, and it mirrors this idea of like giving women center stage. And this was an era in radio when that was in rock radio when that was actually happening, and it didn't for a long time after that. It still isn't now. And radio has become less important, but back then it was extremely important. This was a huge, 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 huge deal. People would listen to the radio all the time. They discovered music via the radio. So it was maybe even a little bit easier for someone like Lisa Loeb to break through because of all the other women's voices at the time. And that's good. I miss that. I feel like we need a little more of that in the mainstream besides just pop music juggernauts.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also good to mention Juliana Hatfield's contribution to this soundtrack, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my favorite songs. So this is Spin the Bottle, which is such a great, like, and teeny song. It's Juliana Hatfield in her most emotionally immature era as a songwriter, and it's great because it's fun. That's the thing. Like, there's a lot of her catalog that gets really dark and really heavy later on, and is very specific. You just can't consume it. You have to really understand the path. But this is before like Evan Dando fucked her over, Juliana Hatfield.
Wait, I don't think I know that history. Can we give like a brief high level of how? I mean, it feels related to your podcast somehow. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong.
Okay.
Evan Dando was the singer of the Lemonheads, and he and Juliana Hatfield had a thing for a long time. And it was a creative partnership, maybe a romantic partnership. It's never been super clear, but they were quite intertwined and on multiple levels. And he was also a serious drug addict. So the relationship fell apart because of his addiction. And there are multiple songs, if not multiple albums, about her devastation coming out of that. But like you can hear Juliana Hatfield doing the backing vocals on My Drug Buddy by Lemonheads. It's really kind of sad when you know how that story plays out. But yeah, this is like in the heyday before he kind of cracked her brain.
Oh, can I tell you about a hilarious Juliana Hatfield tweet about Evan Dando from recent?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
So Jawbreaker, the reunited Jawbreaker, has been touring, and they had the Lemonheads on the West Coast leg of their tour.
Oh.
And I think Evan Dando might still be a serious drug addict because some of those shows did not go well.
Oh.
And Jawbreaker basically kicked the Lemonheads off the tour. Evan Dando tweeted that the guys in Jawbreaker are just a bunch of pussies. And
I remember this now.
And then Juliana Hatfield just tweeted, Jawbreaker, Lemonheads, both candy bands. You would think it would have worked.
Yeah.
Wow. Classy. She's great.
Yeah.
But this is how I
Classy
discovered
and
her.
funny.
She was at the time on 120 Minutes on Alternative Nation. And I'm sure that's how Ben Stiller discovered her. He was not exactly known as a bastion of the underground, but he's the person that put her on this soundtrack, and he directed the video for Spin the Bottle. And I think
Well, I think
wanted it to be the single, is my impression.
Yeah, I think there's something unfortunate about I don't know, Ben Stiller's like general countenance that like makes him uncool looking, because I think secretly he's actually very cool. Unfortunately, he just wasn't born looking like Ethan Hawke. So
He was born looking like Jerry Stiller.
right, exactly. So I think we have to take a beat for a second to talk about how Ben Stiller's character, he wasn't intended to be played by Ben Stiller. I guess it just kind of happened. He had never really planned to be in the film, but he does play the character of Michael, and Michael is this, executive producer or whatever on this fake MTV, which is hilariously called In Your Face, which I did not remember. I've seen this movie once, a really long time. In Your Face is like the fake MTV because they needed to stand in for that, because how do you talk about the 90s without the impact of MTV, right? You already mentioned 120 Minutes, huge deal to a lot of us. But it is pretty hilarious how he and MTV are kind of the stand-ins for selling out in this film.
So I don't know if you know this about me, but I worked at MTV in the 2000s in music programming. And
tell us all about that. How well does this mimic
very well
music programming in MTV?
The offices were very much like MTV, the sort of forced whimsy of it. So Ben Stiller had a TV show on MTV in the 90s. You'll remember his talk show. So he knew what it looked like in there. And he was not like, it looks like they're making fun of it. They're not. They accurately captured what the offices are like.
And the bastardization of the documentary, which causes the conflict in the relationship, 100% like a real world spoof.
Oh, it was a real world promo. Yeah, the real world like opening titles is what it gave me.
Well, it's really funny because at this time, like the real world debuts in 1992, and there's a huge cultural conversation really quickly about what does this mean for MTV, because before that they'd had late night shows or like remote control that would come on sometimes, and sometimes they'd play reruns that should have been on Nickelodeon, like the Monkees or whatever. But this started to be when MTV shifts away from 24 hours of music and towards, oh, this stuff gets us ratings, we need to put more of this on. So the timeliness of this is like so on point, and that becomes a conversation that even when I was there I was there from 2000 to 2008, and I lost track of how many New York Times pieces there were bemoaning that there's no more music on MTV, as they wrote about the Hills or the Osbournes or Nick and Jessica or whatever was the biggest thing. And that started way back when this was happening. So the idea that they make this movie and the script focuses on, will this documentary this girl is making work on In Your Face MTV, without ever considering the music part of it, is really interesting to me now.
Yeah, there's a speech that he gives after she, rushes out of the screening of the launch party of this documentary that he's cut up and edited to be like super sizzly and very like 90s real world MTV, where he starts to tell her like, well, these kids don't want to eat. It's like meatloaf. So we have to be like, oh, here comes the plane, and dumb it down. And I thought that was like really interesting.
And then he goes, I think I can get rid of the Pizza Hut thing.
Yeah. Well, take the thing and it'll be fine, which is also such a like, I don't know, marketing guy response.
Totally. These are, I don't know if these conversations would have been happening at real MTV in the 90s, but I believe they would have, because they certainly were in the 2000s. I mean, it was a little bit different because by then we were segmenting MTV to be aimed at teen girls and be very much about TRL. And we'd launched MTV2 to be for men, like not teenage boys, but a little bit older men. So but there was a lot of conversations like that. We'd have market research meetings all the time where they were when millennials were coming of age, explained to us that these kids have the internet and they don't just like new music. They like everything because they have access to all of it and they know so much more than you think and yada, yada. And so how do we tap into the zeitgeist of what they want? And all these just like ridiculous conversations. Yeah, they were definitely happening. So I imagine these might have been things that Ben Stiller heard at MTV in the 90s as well. I wouldn't be surprised. Like, I think it's so much closer to the truth than people want it to be. It looks like a spoof, and
It felt pretty
not.
yeah, pretty accurate to me. It didn't feel like it was bordering on parody. It felt like, oh yeah, Ben Stiller was probably in that boardroom when something like this got pitched.
I know exactly. With all the toys in his office, that was like how a lot of executives were, honestly. And there was a table in MTV News's conference room that had been there since the 90s that was like a glass top. And underneath it was just like this sculpture of a bunch of pop culture stuff. And you would look and they met in there every single day. Like it wasn't an unused artifact. It was just what it was like. It was weird. And yeah, desperately trying to be cool at all times was the vibe.
I feel bad for Mike Ness because in that little intro, it's his Story of My Life song. And I'm sure he was like, what did I do to deserve this?
Mike Ness, no. He loved success. That guy wanted to be on MTV. He was not like, this is selling out, dude. Not at all. He was ready to play the game. No. Definitely not. And also, Mike Ness had to approve that usage. I mean, he could have easily seen it.
I was going to say, he saw it. He was probably fine with it. He got his bag.
Well, unless he's Brett Daniel and is like, I didn't see it, but I approved it anyways.
Yeah. No.
Mike Ness, he's a hero of where we live. We're in Orange County, California. He's a legend.
Hero is a little strong. He's here.
If you go to downtown Fullerton, they have like quotes of his like painted on walls.
Yeah, we don't have a lot. We've got Gwen Stefani and we've got Mike Ness. So just let us have what we have.
It was a big deal to sign a major label contract and sell out. Bigger deal in the 90s than any other time. And Mike Ness never said no to major label money. So come on, let's be real.
So Chuck Klosterman kind of wrote about the film, about how it's so tied to like the early 90s where like it's so like idealistic to not sell out. Like Ethan Hawke is an asshole, but he has his ideals, and Ben Stiller's Michael is this pretty reasonably nice person, who has a stable job and cares. He's a little bit misguided, maybe a little too concerned with commercialism, but he's painted as like this loser that she should not be with.
Yeah. Because he's uncool. Well, here's the thing that we don't talk about, or we haven't historically talked about when we talked about this concept of selling out from the 90s. To say no to things requires two things. First of all, someone has to have asked you. Like, there's plenty of bands that have said, I would never sell out, but no one ever invited you to the party. So, like, what are you talking about? You cannot RSVP no if you didn't get an invitation. And second of all, there's a classism involved in that. Like, not everybody can afford to say no to money. And the people that can, like, that's what I always wondered about the backstory of Ethan Hawke's character, Troy, which, by the way, is a very fucking white bread name. We hear about his dad being an alcoholic, and it's an ill, like terminally ill, but it's not clear where these ideals come from or if he can actually afford to have them. I mean, he's working as a bartender and meeting women and playing in a band, and he's the epitome of a slacker, although he doesn't exactly. I guess that's not true. Winona Ryder refers to their house as a den of slack. So it comes out, but like, how long is that feasible? How long can you go on like that, existing on the minimum amount of money? And they talk about money a lot in this movie because it's people that just graduated from college working in entry-level jobs and trying to get by on very small amounts of money. But to not have any aspirations to lift yourself out of that is something in the world of music that a lot of bands who have an infinite amount of money have been able to do. Like, I always think of REM talking about how they would never license their music to a commercial or any commercial entity to use because it changes the like soul of the music, but they will for films, people that they like, and projects that they're into. And I think it's easy to say that while sitting on top of millions of dollars. But when you move into an era where you don't have a steady income, you don't have health insurance, you can't quit your day job to be a musician. If you don't ever become super successful, how do you maintain that?
Yeah, I always assumed that Ethan Hawke's character is sort of coasting on some suburban Chicago white privilege, that he's probably not grown up in any kind of poverty and doesn't really understand that struggle. So it's easy to romanticize it. It's easy to glamorize it because it's not part of the fabric that made him. It's simply something that, as you said, he's kind of like idealizing, right? You can be in a failing bar band called Hey, That's My Bike when you don't have a lot of stakes in the game and you're 23 years old in 1994, which,
things were a lot more affordable.
Back from,
and you can afford to go out of state for college.
Right, exactly. So my thing is like, it's like, okay, well, they obviously all went to university. They're all like of means to a degree.
And of all the money struggles they talk about, college loans aren't really one of them because it wasn't unaffordable to go to college then.
Right. Different time, different economic times, different factors at play. You didn't have to, there was no concept of the hustle, the grind, having to do things on the side or monetize your passions. Like, that's not part of the conversation in this film because 1994 was a very different time and place.
Yeah, and Winona Ryder has to kind of struggle with whether she wants to accept this used car from her dad or not.
A BMW. Right.
The tragedy, right? The absolute tragedy. And it's easy to kind of see, like, I kind of figured I would rewatch this again as like a very old lady and be like, well, Ben Stiller is clearly going to be like the logical choice. But I kind of totally get it, right? She's 23 years old. Who's going to pick Ben Stiller over Ethan Hawke? You're not.
No way.
You just won't. Ben Stiller is in the car listening to Peter Frampton's "Baby I Love Your Way,"
the most uncool, the most uncool song ever. A cover of the most uncool song that was so deeply overplayed in the 70s that even by the 90s, people knew that was code for this guy's not cool.
Right. Exactly. There's no contest.
Yeah.
From that
moment forward. And they even reference it again in High Fidelity, where they're watching Marie DeSalle at the club and she's covering it. And they're like, oh, I don't like this song, but I kind of like it when she does it.
Yeah. I mean, we can do it. I didn't pick High Fidelity because I saw that you guys had already done it, but man, I could rip that whole movie apart so easily.
Well, we already have.
We already have. For anyone that hasn't listened to the podcast, to that podcast, if you want to hear us rip High Fidelity apart,
but I think this touches on like talking about the "Baby I Love Your Way" of it all, and I'm sure we'll get to My Sharona shortly. That a lot of the songs on the soundtrack are not from the 90s, which is an interesting thing. I was thinking about that when you're talking about what became the lead single when they just sent the soundtrack out, and I'm like, well, there are several songs that are already out of the running because they came out 2 decades ago or 10 years ago, or were already a single previously, like that U2 song, like the Lenny Kravitz song. So nobody was going to pick those. Those were all not options.
Right. My Sharona by the Knack is distinctly an 80s song, but there is a lot of, from the sitcoms that they're watching to the songs that they're sort of invested in, there's a little bit of backwards looking nostalgia to the 70s and 80s.
And a lot of Schoolhouse Rock sing-alongs.
Schoolhouse Rock, like she's singing along to Schoolhouse Rock when she's sad to I'm Just a Bell, which is very relatable. The My Sharona moment, I arguably like kind of the most iconic music moment from this film. It's probably what people associate the most with the film itself.
I think so. It's also my least favorite music moment in the film. It's just, that song is bad. That is not a good song. And I've always wondered why. I don't know the story. So if you guys do, tell me, what was the process of picking that song? Because it's fine for where it is and it works in the moment, but it's just there are so many good. I think that song's actually from 79. And there's so many good, like cheesy ass rock songs from that era. Why why that one?
I don't know if I have the story for exactly why they picked the song, but I know that the soundtrack came out on RCA Records, and Ben Stiller and Karen Rockman, who is the soundtrack supervisor, they met with RCA, and RCA said like, "Hey, here's our catalog of artists. Like, choose whoever you want for your soundtrack." And they chose the rap song by Me Fi Me,
Yeah,
and then everything else is not from RCA Records.
Which, by the way, that would not happen. Like 10 years later, that wouldn't have been allowed to happen. It would have been 90% songs from whoever was the label putting it together, because they would own the masters and not want to pay the licensing fees on everything else. And then, maybe you get one or two from somebody else.
Yeah, they picked the one song, and it's like the least consequential artist out of the whole soundtrack.
That is truly a one time only, never again would that happen moment.
I always took the My Sharona moment to be like, you don't have to like it, but you kind of have to acknowledge that it's catchy. It's kind of like Mickey. You may not be listening to it recreationally, and it may not be your favorite song, but it's an earworm and everybody knows it. So if it were to come on and you're like high in the gas station convenience store, it would conceivably be something that you would ask the guy behind the counter to turn up and then like ironically dance to.
Oh yeah, this is some seriously ironic dancing. They're making fun of it as much as they're enjoying it. Let's also talk about the sort of undertones, the Me Tooing of My Sharona. That song is about an underage girl. That song is about wanting to date a high schooler. So that's fun.
Speaking of beautiful girls, our last episode.
We can't talk anymore about wanting to date teenagers on this podcast. I think like there's a moratorium now on that. I want to talk about, though, like my favorite music moment is the sort of opening scene of the movie where they're driving to Tempted by Squeeze.
Yeah.
And she flicks a cigarette into Ben Stiller's car and causes an accident, and that's their meet cute. I had forgotten how much, like as a young girl child, I really liked this song. I don't know why. I just really liked it. I think it's because it's got like very simple sing-alongable lyrics about like toothbrushes and shit.
Yeah, like Squeeze is one of those, another coded band where they're just like below the mainstream enough in British pop music in the 80s that it's like a wink to being cool if you catch that and you know them and you know that song. And the other artists like that in this film is Crowded House. They have 2 songs in here. And I am such a huge Neil Finn fan.
Yeah.
There's something like whenever Ben Stiller's trying to make a happy world, he goes to artists like that. I would arguably say the Big Mountain song, the World Party song are that also. These sort of nice confections, but he digs a little deeper than the most obvious thing. It's not what you'd expect. All of that to me adds up to make the soundtrack a really mixed bag of stuff. Like it doesn't make sense as a soundtrack. It makes sense within the world of the movie. But when you put it on an album, it's just like, and what do we have here? What is this? What is this collection of songs? Why do they go together? I'm not sure.
I believe the guy from World Party also scored the movie.
Yes, I think you're right. And the guy from World Party do you guys know his whole background? He's from the Waterboys, the Whole of the Moon, that band. They're such a great, like, also an underground 80s band. And he helped record Sinead O'Connor's first album. He was like an engineer, a producer on it. He's a very cool guy. Very cool guy.
And Robbie Williams covered one of his songs and got to #1 in the UK charts.
Ah, that's nice. I love that. Love that for Robbie Williams. But yes, that is a cute meet cute song. I agree. Like that is it makes it into such an earworm because it's such a promising moment, a weirdly promising moment.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's a great little tune, underrated little tune. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I also really love Crowded House, and I love my parents when I was a kid used to have one of those like juke boxes that had like the neon lights around it, and it's half oval shape, right? You guys know, like a classic looking jukebox, but on the inside it was retrofitted to play CDs. And so
Oh.
I remember it was retrofitted to play CDs, but they weren't like cool CDs. They were like Garth Brooks and, things that like as a kid I was probably not automatically drawn to, but they did have the very best of Crowded House. And I remember just enjoying the shit out of Crowded House as a kid because it was the best thing in that jukebox.
I did not appreciate them at the time. This is like something about them popped off for me when I got older. And now I've been to see Crowded House and Neil Finn solo so many times that it's embarrassing.
Wow. No, it's not embarrassing. I think they're great. And I think they don't get discussed enough for being great. I think because they're just like, as you said, kind of like a little under the radar, a little lower key than a lot of bands of the era.
I'm not sure I'm ready to say Ben Stiller is cool, but I will say like Ben Stiller gets it. Like Ben Stiller knows what's up.
Gets it. Like I feel like Ben Stiller, I can relate to Ben Stiller's personal brand of cool because it's not a showy kind of cool, but he definitely gets it. He knows how to put together a film. I appreciate the work that he did to put a lot of this stuff together.
Yeah, and this is his directorial debut.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty amazing.
I mean, it's a solid first movie. A lot better than, let's say, Wes Anderson's first movie or even Richard Linklater's first movie.
And I think as a director, he's got a pretty good track record.
Yeah, he does. I mean, Severance was amazing. Dare was so obsessed with it. Okay.
He did the pilot, right?
He did the whole series.
Oh, he did the whole series? I know he did the pilot. I wasn't aware that he did the whole thing.
He was very involved, like to a degree of I heard things were weird. So I think there's also a cute moment with Ben Stiller and Winona when they're in the car and the big gulps and Baby I Love Your Way is on. That for me almost redeems the song because of like the awkward cuteness and the hopefulness that she has there and the like juggling the big gulp cup to be able to kiss some guy in his convertible. It feels very like a princess moment. And then she gets bumped back down to real life immediately in her apartment when she encounters Troy, the love of her life or the love of her 20s, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that moment makes you think that maybe these crazy kids are going to make it. Like maybe she can be, maybe they can merge their two worlds, but, then you also kind of realize by the end, like, no, she's just kind of like, it's tourism for her. Like, she's just kind of, testing that out as you do at 23.
So the screenwriter is Helen Childress. And I guess she went to college with a guy named Troy Dyer. And he ended up suing the producers.
What? Oh, I didn't know this.
Yeah, he sued because, I guess he is a film financier. And people would be like, oh, so Troy Dyer, like the Reality Bites Troy Dyer. So he sued the producers and Helen Childress, and it wasn't resolved until like she gave him like a written like letter to say like, I did not base this character off of you.
And did he then frame it and hang it in his office? Like, what do you do with that? That's hilarious.
Yeah, I assume he like would laminate it and bring it to his meetings like, I am not the Troy from Reality Bites. I have it in writing.
Wow.
The good news is he's now totally ungoogleable. And that is
He sounds more like a Michael than he does a Troy.
He does sound more like a Michael. That sounds true.
But speaking of Troy, what do we think of Ethan Hawke's abilities as vocalist and his fake band, Hey, That's My Bike? Let's talk about Hey, That's My Bike.
Well, I also think it's kind of interesting that a few years ago he did a movie called Juliet Naked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that movie.
Oh, yeah.
I almost feel like that is like Troy like 20 years later.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a Nick Hornby novel, so yeah, it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like there's a whole Ethan Hawke like interconnected universe in the same way that like Phoebe Waller-Bridge has her own like universe of people that she's like, anyway, I could go on, but it's not going to make a lot of sense. Maya Hawke is now like a singer-songwriter in her own right, his daughter Maya Hawke. So
I like her stuff. I think she's got a great voice. Okay. Hey, That's My Bike. Maybe one of the worst band names ever. Definitely top 10.
So bad. is so bad.
Definitely top 10. And his voice is not good in this movie. I think he gets some vocal training later in life, but this was not this band is, I think it's not supposed to be good though, because we're supposed to know this band is not going anywhere. They're not leaving
Yes.
Houston. They're not getting a
Yeah.
record deal. Not even Sub Pop is interested. Like, it's just not happening.
His vocals in this movie are as good as his Mandarin accent in Moon Knight.
Oh, okay.
Messed up.
Shots fired. So, but we have to talk about the Violent Femme song that he sings, which is that moment watching it now as an adult, like I got it, like it's a punishment, and I felt that was, you know, defensible when I was young because I was stupid. Watching it as an adult, I'm just like, that's the moment you never talk to that person again. That is the no,
It's
we're
vicious.
done.
Yeah.
It's the darling Nikki moment of this movie.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's just humiliating. I mean, there's something really humiliating about discussing your sex life with someone from the stage and pointedly making it clear who you're singing about. And this is the kind of insult that women got in the 90s. This stuff is deeply unacceptable now, but this was like the Madonna whore complex put on blast for the 90s. So it's also like a really unique song in the Violent Femmes catalog to me, because most of their stuff is not like this. It's not this kind of aggressiveness. It's a little darker.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the moment in the film too, like Ethan Hawke isn't singing it so much as just spitting it.
Yeah.
It's vicious.
It's pretty vicious when they do it too. Like, it's not a polite song. It's not like, not cool.
For sure. And you only get like 10 seconds of it. You don't get a lot of it. You get enough of it to know like, wow, this is a very cruel put down.
So this is the point where I start to question the whole friend group. So Janine Garofalo is also in this movie, and Steve Zahn. They have the best scenes together. I also think they get like the best music together. I think every time they're in a scene, the music's great. But do they not hear about this moment and grab her and be like, okay, that was really messed, like, you know, that was messed up, right? And you don't have to talk to him anymore. Like, we can kick him out of our friend group. He can be over. But no.
Yeah, it's tough. Like, they really don't make any concerted attempt to cancel him at any point in this film. He's just kind of like accepted in the way that I think you accept when you're in your early 20s and the stakes are lower, like people really fucking up, but they can stay in the friend group as long as, you know, whatever, nobody's like permanently maimed is sort of how I took it.
Yeah.
But it's bad. I also found myself, speaking of Janine Garofalo and Steve Zahn, who are both fantastic, I really found myself wanting like their spinoff. Like, they don't get enough in this movie.
And they have the richest backstory. Like, I mean, it makes sense. We're going to focus on the romance. That's what we did. It's a rom-com. We do that. But I agree with you. I would love just a second movie about where they go.
Right?
And you might get it because they're developing a Reality Bites TV series now.
Oh no.
Who?
I don't know if I want it.
Which network? Who's doing it?
Peacock.
Oh no, I don't want it. I'm not sure I want it. No, it's not in your face. And look, you're just lucky it's not MTV Networks, right? MTV Networks is not the studio behind it, right? Tell me they're not.
I don't think so, because this movie, it's technically a Universal film, I think.
Okay, then yeah, it'll just be the Peacock universe. Well, maybe, I don't know. They've had a few things. It's pretty hit or miss over there. I
don't know. The charm of this film, though, you take it away from the backdrop of 1994, and I'm pretty sure it loses anything that made it good. I'm not really into like next generation type of things like this, so we'll see. But
I think it's our relation. Like, so much of this movie to me is about selling out and do I or don't I? And that is not a concept that exists like, authenticity is just not the same as it was in 1994. Not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we live in a world where people aspire to be influencers now. And that's also not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. We live in a world where the majority of money is controlled by corporations who now are legally recognized as people. So, I mean, nobody has any choice but to sell out at this point. Like, there's not a lot of homegrown stuff happening. So unless a Reality Bites reboots is like a reboot is somebody trying to open a flower shop in their hometown. I mean, I don't know what it would be. Like, what are you protecting? What would be the point? And if you take it away from that premise, how is it Reality Bites?
Yeah, it's so true. I don't know how you do that unless they're going back to the 90s and it's a period piece or something. But yeah, if I don't get to see like a pre 9/11 airport, I don't want it.
I mean, the outfits. It's really another thing I was thinking about when I was going back and watching this is how much people have stayed obsessed with the 90s. And we haven't really, we're maybe in 2000s nostalgia now, maybe, but mostly it's criticism. I mean, it's criticism about fat phobia and sexism and racism from that era, whereas we don't seem to think about the 90s with that framework, although we certainly should.
We certainly should. Yeah.
But the 90s just have stayed pristine. And it's fun to me to go back to this movie from the 90s and remember how real it felt that people were that nostalgic for the 70s then.
Yeah, really nostalgic for the 70s. This is a mild tangent, but there is a lot of 90s nostalgia right now aesthetically and in fashion. I was at a Big Thief show this week and it was outdoors and it was like a picnic, right? So Hollywood Forever, if you're familiar with that and you're from LA.
Yeah.
Everybody's out there for a picnic. 80% of the young women at this concert were dressed like that meme of Nicole Kidman where she's like just got divorced and she's wearing like the camisole top and like the, like the sort of knee length like slip skirts, right?
Yes.
But also a bunch of them have like full on like thong, like whale tails, like
oh
from
God.
like because that's the thing again now. So it's fascinating to me how like the cyclical that is, and the idea that, like you said, I think the 90s and a little bit of the early 2000s and that lead, like it's kind of preserved in amber in terms of like I think people feel that that's the perfectly authentic aesthetic. Like that's aspirational right now. That's how everybody wants to like kind of look and be. They want to go to that place where things and people maybe felt a little bit more real, which is what this movie does, right? Like Winona Ryder and her like very off the rack, like button down diner dresses from the Gap, which you had. I think a lot of people find that to be a very comforting place to kind of live.
Okay, there's another connection we haven't touched on, a star of the movie and band connection, and that is U2 and Winona Ryder. So U2, All I Want Is You plays when she realizes she has to have Troy and she runs romantically to get the greasy-haired man with no job. Pan away.
But doesn't that reflect her real life where she is dating Dave Pirner from Soul Asylum?
Yes. Like that was always mysterious.
Who was also in the movie.
Listen, Winona Ryder's dating history though, like fascinating, incredible.
Speaking of Jeff Tweedy.
Great run.
Like just every guy who was in a cool band. But so I don't know that U2 ended up on the soundtrack because of her, but I know she was involved in like getting them to say yes because she's been friends with them and considers Bono like a father figure. And I've read something about this. Oh, well, I read something about this in an interview with Courtney Love, where Courtney is like, Winona took me to my first U2 concert and like just everybody knew her, the band knew her and they revered her and she could do anything and could do no wrong. And that's literally what it's like to be anywhere with Winona Ryder. I was like, yeah, that sounds about right.
That tracks. Did Courtney Love throw shoes at the edge?
I don't think so. I think this was during her Malibu era, so she was being the most civilized version of Courtney Love.
It's a good era. Anyway, yeah. So I'm a very vocal. I feel like I've been very vocal on this show about not being a huge U2 fan, but maybe it's coming off of Beautiful Girls and feeling like this film is just such a like breath of fresh air. But the montage that we speak of at the end, right? where she's pining for him and he's pining for her, and they're pre 9/11 airports and payphones and flaming heads, chain smoking, right?
So much smoking. There's so much smoking in this movie. It's just
so much smoking in this movie. I don't even smoke.
And just regular cigarettes, not even weed.
Yeah.
No, like, people are just smoking.
Just everybody is smelly, and it hops off the screen at you how smelly all of these 23-year-olds are.
No, sure. This movie is like pungent. Like it feels like being in the smokiest, shittiest dive bar because there's so much smoking. But this montage scene, U2's All I Want Is You, is playing over it. I had two thoughts on this. One, I kind of remembered how much I actually do like this song. I actually think it's kind of like top tier U2. Yeah. I think it's a great song.
It's a great song.
And I can't deny it. I think it's a great song. U2 wrote this song for his wife. I feel like it maybe means a little more than some U2 songs. I mean, not the ones that are, like about Ireland, right? But like it's
not
just,
the political ones, just the other emotions that you think U2 doesn't have.
Right, exactly. Like, corporate U2, it's not corporate U2. It's like pre that. Yeah. It's a nice song. It's a great ballad. But I also wondered to myself, why didn't they put Lisa Loeb's Stay here?
Because to take Troy's shirt out of her laundry, the U2 is a much better choice than Lisa Loeb.
That part is like, she's like, because that's what you said. Like she goes to run after like the greasy-haired unemployed man, and I think you really get hit by that when she pulls his dirty-ass boxer shorts like out of her own pants because she's doing laundry. Oh yeah, why didn't they put Stay in it? Because I feel there were two.
First of all, I think if they're within the reality of this reboot of Reality Bites, I want to see the Lainey character on TikTok complaining about this behavior that was somehow endearing then and now is literally what would make you go viral. But second, I think because U2 is a much more cinematic band, like that song, the climax, the way that it ramps up musically, like the Edge's guitar specifically, it's just so much more compelling. And it's a lot of soundtracks from the 90s do this where they tell you how you should feel with the music. And my impression is that Ben Stiller really wanted you to feel, in case you weren't sold on this pair, we're going to have this song drive up and your heart is going to swell in this moment because there is a chance you're not sold on this guy. And I don't know that, like, Lisa Loeb was a little too soft. It's pretty, but there's no real climactic driving moment in that song that makes you feel like this is imperative, this is imminent, it has to happen now. So much so that
it's too understated. It's too understated. You're right. Say what you will about U2, and I have. But they are a very cinematic band.
Yeah, we have a whole Patreon episode about Nicole explaining the plot of Sing 2 to me.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's pretty deep cuts there, dudes.
Yeah, well, I mean, for those that have never seen Sing 2, Bono plays a prominent role.
Amazing tweet about that is when they announced their Las Vegas residency, someone said, I didn't know Sing 2 is a biopic.
So look, that makes like 3 people that have seen Sing 2 laugh. I'm sorry.
My history with U2 is complex. I don't have one solid opinion, but I understood them a little better after. So I moved away from New York in 2015. And one of my good friends was like, look, the last thing we're going to do is U2's playing at Madison Square Garden. And I'm friends with one of their managers. So we're going to get really good tickets and go. And that's going to be the last concert you go to. And I was like, wow, okay, that feels good. And we did. And I mean, the tickets were amazing. And I even, the manager even like held out earplugs for me. He's like, you haven't been to a U2 show before, right? Okay, you're gonna need these, because we were on the floor. And he was right. I mean, I did need them. And then Bruce Springsteen came out and did the encore with them. Like, it was epic. But seeing it and kind of seeing behind the scenes a little more made me understand the machinery that is U2. Like, it's not just a band, it's a business, in the same way that the Rolling Stones are, or Zeppelin would have been. So it's bigger than just I love 80s U2, but it's so much, they got so much bigger than that. And even post 9/11 U2, I remember I was working at MTV when all of those like songs to make you happy because the world is depressed album videos came in. And it felt inauthentic, but it also felt like maybe we kind of need this. So yeah, like I don't love all of it either, but there are some things I really do love. And there even have been some later catalog things I've come to love, like City of Blinding Lights. Like, how do you not feel great listening to that song? It's just very, I don't know, Bono is in love with the world sometimes, and you just have to take it at face value. Like, but it is interesting. This is a 90s U2 song, which is maybe one of their most loathed periods. And somehow it works. Somehow this song just really, really works.
Yeah, it works for me too. And you know, if I were Bono, I don't begrudge him feeling good, right? I would also feel happy if I had multiple casts.
And you got to think about and you got to think about it as a first-time director, Ben Stiller. Are you really going to take the risk of unsigned, unknown Lisa Loeb, or are you going to stick U2 in there?
First-time director Ben Stiller, if U2 says, yeah, we'll let you use our song at an affordable rate for your like $10 million budget movie, are you going to say no to that? Yeah. You'd be crazy.
I think in my brain, it's like some kind of, you know, like it's some kind of Mandela effect sort of thing where I'm like, I expect Stay to be in the movie and it's not technically in the movie, and it feels like the one place that it might.
Here's the thing. This was also something that was different about movies in the 80s and the 90s. The biggest song and the song that was a single was always the song that was over the credits. For whatever reason, it was rarely in the movie. It was always at the end. Maybe because people actually stayed to watch the credits back then. I mean, it was a thing. But yeah, that was a place of honor. Like that was a very a wanted placement.
True.
It feels like a throwaway now because we don't even watch the credits on TV shows. Like nobody's watching the end of the movie.
One of my complaints with streaming, though, is that it automatically kicks you to the next thing on a lot of platforms. So oftentimes you don't even really get to, if you watch this on Peacock, they're already kicking you to the next thing on Peacock. So you don't get
you have to intentionally say, no, I want to watch the credits.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. If you walk away to go like grab a LaCroix like I did, you are not going to get to enjoy the tones of Lisa Loeb.
Yeah, you're just going to get kicked to episode 1 of Reality Bites, the TV show.
We thought you might like beautiful girls. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, God. I mean, it's not an incorrect assumption, let's be honest, but in 1996, not so much in 2023.
So the soundtrack supervisor, her name is Karen Rackman, and she was pretty prolific in the 90s. She did soundtrack supervision for a lot of Tarantino stuff, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, also Judgment Night and Clueless. So I feel like she had a really good run there.
Okay.
Great run.
Interesting. I mean, so this is the thing. 90s soundtracks, Clueless like is another one where there's a lot of songs not from the 90s and a mix of music that doesn't make sense. And it's because, in part, it's because they would use songs to like define who a character is. And with these disparate, like the whole trope of the 90s was like this person who's like this and this person who's completely different clash together and then fall in love or then start a business or then, you know, get into a shootout on Christmas night, whatever. But making that into a soundtrack where songs are character profiles as much as they're anything else, or they're letting you know you're in the gap now, and that's why Crowded House is playing. It makes for such a weird soundtrack, and so many soundtracks from the 90s are totally incongruent because of that sort of music placement theory.
Yeah, the Clueless is like Coolio, Boss Tones, Radiohead.
That Boss Tones plays at the party scene in Clueless, by the way, is the weirdest thing ever. That's so like, I don't understand. Why?
No, you're right though. It's not the like intentionally curated soundtrack of, say, like Hunger Games or like Twilight, where I feel like they put all this thought into like, how are these songs going to be all like commercially viable? There's
Or like, what age is our audience? So what are they listening to now?
Exactly.
Right.
It feels very market researched, right? Like this doesn't feel that way. This feels very much like, no, this is what worked for the film. And as you said, Courtney, like the coveted spot ends up being that title song, because that's the one thing that doesn't need to be considered as part of the story.
That's right. You can go with your strongest song that has absolutely nothing to do with the movie in that spot.
So, speaking of Stay, so Lisa Loeb went to Brown,
Yeah.
and she went to college with both Duncan Sheik, who had some songs of his own.
Very smooth voice guy of the 90s.
I think Barely Breathing is still a bop.
I agree.
And then Elizabeth Mitchell, who later formed the band Ida.
Oh, okay. I'm only surprised that Lisa Loeb didn't go to Oberlin, frankly.
Liz Phair did, though.
I know, Liz Phair did.
Only one can come from Oberlin. Yeah, so they played together in college, Elizabeth Mitchell and Lisa Loeb. Elizabeth Mitchell actually does backing vocals on Stay.
Okay.
And she is now I guess a very successful children's songwriter.
That's always a weird path to go down.
And I think Lisa Loeb has actually gone into that.
She has. She does books
down that
and
path as well.
albums, I think. Yeah.
And also random cameos on nostalgia grab shows like Fuller House.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that I saw that.
Yeah, it's funny how much staying power Stay has had. Like they use it like in an episode of Workaholics like a bunch, and then she shows up at the end of that episode. And I think Newfound Glories, they did like a second covers record, and they did that song, and she does vocals on that as well. So
when Newfound Glory was ripping off Me First and the Gimme Gimmes, they did a Lisa Loeb song, is what you're telling me? That's like so
on the
many
second
degrees away
volume.
from
So
being
once
cool.
once they realized that it was like a viable commercial thing for them, they did a
Neat.
second volume, and they did Stay on that one.
Right. And that guy's divorced from Haley from Paramore, is that right?
Oh, I don't.
Yeah.
Really?
Like, isn't that who she married? The guy from... No, maybe it's not Newfound Glory. I don't know. Anyway, they seem uncool.
Some
Go
41
on.
or something.
No, that was Avril. Avril married.
But yeah, lots of bad
Some
taste
41
there.
to Nickelback.
It's a
Canadians,
pipeline.
I don't know, Canadians. You can't like make sense. It's not the same.
There's no accounting for.
So
Tell us more about
um,
Stay. I need to know. Tell me what did Stereo Gums do a number ones about it, or did they do a We Have a
Yeah,
File on You?
Yeah, they did the number ones on it.
Okay.
So it's Tom Brehan.
Okay, tell me what Tom said. I know that this was I remember it was not, she didn't have an album and she wasn't signed when this came out, so she got a record deal from this. And she's
Right.
the first artist to get onto the Billboard charts without a record deal, which seems insane. Like, how had that never happened before?
Well,
But-
first to get to number one without a
To
record
number
deal.
one. Okay. Which is pretty remarkable. Like in the 90s, you had to sell a lot of copies of something to get to number one. That was tough. Like people were still buying albums then, so that was no easy feat.
Yeah, and Tom Brehan points out that, like a lot of the bands like Pearl Jam and Nirvana, like their labels were not releasing singles because they wanted to push people to buy albums. So, like even Smells Like Teen Spirit, like I think that peaked at like number 6.
Wow, that's so wild.
So the producer of Stay was Lisa Loeb's boyfriend at the time. His name is Juan Patino.
Okay.
And he actually also produced Jules, You Were Meant for Me.
Those are not dissimilar tonally, like aesthetically, as songs and artists.
Tracks.
Yeah. Although I never really liked Jewel, and I did like Lisa Loeb. I don't know what that means.
It means you weren't from Alaska.
Maybe I just don't like blondes. No offense. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't mean anything.
Guys might hear in the bathroom really quickly and run back. I had no choice but to like Jewel. It's an era thing, maybe too. I feel like she was forced upon me in cereal boxes and warehouse video stores, and
You're not incorrect.
I just wasn't. There was really no other alternative.
I think it was last winter. So Greg Kirsten and Dave Grohl have been doing this Hanukkah session series.
Okay, that seems like the most LA thing. That's the most LA way to start a sentence I've ever heard.
And last year they did a cover of Stay, but they did like a metal version of it.
Oh, that sounds really cute. I would love that.
I'll find it. I'll send it to you.
Okay. So there's one other song in this soundtrack I wanted to talk about. And it's the first song that plays when we're in the montage and opening credits. And it's Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll Part 2.
Which is used on a lot of movie soundtracks.
Yes, it is. I mean, another problematic person, obviously, making their way onto the soundtrack. But also, a part of why this immediately resonated with me was because it wasn't just on movie soundtracks. That was also at every sporting event you went to in the 90s. And my high school band played it a ton. And by band, I mean marching band. So I played that every Friday night for about 3 years straight. And I was literally in high school when this movie came out. So I was just like, oh yeah, this is very true to Houston, not realizing that phenomenon extended beyond that, but it just really bolstered my idea that this was an authentically Houstonian movie.
What did you play in the marching band?
Drums.
Nice.
Freshman year, it was cymbals though. So, you know.
Yeah, that was like one of the ultimate jock jams in the 90s before we all realized who Gary Glitter really was.
Yeah.
Again, there's a whole other podcast lingering somewhere about how jock jams are really just like glam songs from the 70s, which is truly, truly weird to me. Like, so many jock jams are like the least jock thing that you could probably but sure.
Yeah, it was many years before I realized that the song had a name, that it was Rock and Roll Part 2. It was just a da 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 da, hey, da 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 da.
It's the Hey song. Yeah.
And there's
eventually replaced by Bro Hymn.
I don't think I've been to a high school football game since 1996, so I don't know what they're doing now. I do know that they play the White Stripes though on like the NFL, and I find that weird. So there's also
they played
and soccer games like across the world.
Yeah, and well, that makes sense. It's a big thing I've heard as well.
That makes sense to me. Soccer games for sure. There's also
Song 2 by Blur,
which is also, I mean, that makes sense at soccer. Yes, and I love it. I love that for Blur. I hope Damon Albarn is rich off of just that. So
I mean, he's rich for many different reasons.
I guess gorillas exist, whatever. So there's also the two songs that play whenever Winona's character is checking out in Your Face TV, and they're impossibly cool, and they both have a really kind of funny backstory. And one of them is Arrested Development, Give a Man a Fish, which is not a video that really got played on MTV much because MTV was still segregating hip hop into Yo MTV Raps, and that's about it at that time. After dabbling with gangster rap in the late 80s and getting in a lot of trouble for it. And the other one is Arise by Sepultura, and that video was actually banned by MTV because someone was nailed to a cross in it, and I guess it was too controversial for the standards department to play it. You'd be amazed. So I got a lot of feedback from standards at MTV in my day as well, and because it's a channel that was a primary part of the audience was under 18 and under 13, the standards were even higher. Like Disney was the same, and Nickelodeon, they were even tougher about, and there was a lot of day parting what videos would play. So like Headbangers Ball wasn't just on late at night because that's when metal people watch TV, or because they were pushing it to a late time because nobody liked it. It was because those videos were often very explicit and they needed it, or the imagery was controversial and they needed it to air late at night.
Yeah, I remember the Prodigy video for Smack My Bitch Up had to debut at like midnight on like a Sunday night,
But that
Monday
was
morning.
cool how they did that. Like they made it an event. It was like, we can't play
Right.
this, but we're running promos
Right.
for it, so we can't play it. Like by the 90s, MTV was kind of hip to that game.
Right. For sure. I was
Too
gonna
hot
ask,
for TV.
yeah, well, I was gonna ask that though, like how much of it was standards and practices, and how much of it was them knowing that if we promote something late at night that's like quote unquote banned, we know we're gonna find more traction for it. It's gonna be like an object of fascination.
Well, I'll tell you this story. So when Jay-Z brought in the video for 99 Problems, Standards gave him a bunch of edits to it, and he was like, no, I'm not doing any of those. I'm not making any of those edits. Don't play it. And MTV was like, I mean, I was one of the people. I was like, we can't do that. We can't not play the new Jay-Z song. What? So it becomes a thing where you find a way to make it work, where it's like, okay, if we leave all of this in, what day parts can we play it in? When will it be acceptable? And then you promote that.
Before we continue with our episode, here's a word from our sponsor.
Enjoy listening to podcasts and ever wonder, can I make a podcast? But it seems so complicated, and good audio production can take time. What if there was a way to create an amazing podcast easily? Well, now there is. Introducing Podcasting Made Easy from Podtastic Audio. My production team will handle your entire audio production, allowing you to be the star of your show. This is Podcasting Made Easy. How easy? Well, so easy, you don't even have to press record. Now that's easy. Your listeners are waiting. Let's deliver. Sign up for a free strategy call today at podcasticaudio.com/easy.
Wait, no, you hadn't seen Reality Bites before this.
I
You
hadn't
watched
seen
it before
Reality.
this.
Yeah.
So what did you end up thinking? What are your takeaways here?
I really enjoyed it. I thought it was, I think for being almost 30 years old, I think it is something I can still relate to. Like, I think if I had seen this like the day I graduated college, it would have defined too much of my 20s.
I mean,
You know?
her parents, that dinner with her parents is the most, like, boomers are still like that. That's a very just boomers moment.
Just that opening image of her mom like cutting the meat for her husband.
Dad, stop talking to mom like she's a child. Well, she married one.
Yeah, that was a great line.
It's not wrong.
No. The only like major thing with the movie that I kind of don't like is just Ethan Hawke's kind of 90s I'm kind of an asshole and that makes me kind of deep sort of thing that was going on. You know, it's kind of the same thing with like High Fidelity and what they're trying to do with Beautiful Girls. Like, oh, they're assholes because they're damaged and they're deep or something. Like it's kind of shorthand for like this is gritty and real.
I went in wanting to, not like his character, but the really unfortunate roadblock to that is that he's hot.
He's sexy. Yeah.
Sorry. Like, I get it because I'm like, yeah, well, obviously.
And there's also that moment when he and Winona are like, he's fired from the newsstand and they're walking and talking about their friendship. And he seems so open and sincere. And it's just that thing where, especially in your 20s, you were so susceptible to guys that give you those moments of vulnerability without realizing that is like 10% of the time with them. And the other 90%, they're terrible.
Right. You're living for that 10% of oxygen they give you with these, very like erudite kind of conversations that you're not getting from the Ben Stiller types in your life. So I understood it. I get it. In the world of the film, I feel like it works. Do I feel like that couple is going to last? No. Probably not.
But that's a great 20s romance. Here's the thing. We always talk about this as should she have chosen him or him? There's never been a point where we come to a revisionist conversation where we say, why didn't she just choose herself and her art and screw both of these guys? She actually doesn't need either of them. She's just trying to make
Janine Garofalo and Steve Zahn.
Exactly.
Well, right. Right. Because she actually does have like pretty cool friends in
Yeah.
the form of Janine Garofalo and Steve Zahn's characters. So she could live a very happy life as an auteur, which is what I kind of hope the next chapter would be if they were to ever like revisit this. But this is not a Before Sunrise type of situation, Ethan Hawke film, where we're going to find out like what happens next. Like there is no what happens next, I feel like.
You're right. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. I would love for this to be a Before Sunrise trilogy movie, but no.
Well, unfortunately, he just disappears too much for it to actually work.
Well, I mean, he doesn't even need to be in the second one. The second one can be her in her 30s and she and Ben Stiller are together now because that didn't work out.
But then we just have like a Sex in the City situation where they keep bringing back like all the old boyfriends from whatever.
Or it becomes a Mamma Mia situation where it's like, which one's the daddy?
You know what? I mean, maybe to that too, but I don't dislike either of those. I find something very gratifying about revisiting the old boyfriends because I'm so curious about what did they do? Did they I mean, these people don't fall off the side of the earth when they stop being in a relationship with the main character. There's always some story there that's interesting. And also
Maybe
Colin
he's
Firth,
maybe selling cars in Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, when he comes back in the suit, there is kind of like the mildest hint of like maybe he's going to be a respectable.
He's not. He definitely became like somebody who works as a creative director and is the biggest sellout of them all.
You know any of them, Nicole?
No, I've never met anyone that like, does anybody for my job listen to this? No, all creative directors are wonderful. Please keep being. Round of applause.
The copy editor, that's what he would be, chief copy editor for a brand.
Because he actually does know the definition of irony.
Yeah. And also eventually gets someone pregnant and has to raise money to support this child.
Yeah, that guy's going to have just an epic midlife crisis for sure.
Juliet Naked,
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think, again, the thing about the characters in this film is that, like, no matter what the failings of the writing, the directing may be, and I'm not saying it has them, but I'm saying, if there are things you object to, I don't think you can really deny that the casting is pretty perfect. And the people in these roles I'm buying what they're selling.
Yeah.
Which I think is why it became a defining film of its era.
Yeah. And as much as I want to follow up, I do really appreciate how much it captures the angst of that era. That's the problem I have with 90s nostalgia is I was so angst-ridden then that it's uncomfortable to revisit it sometimes because it means accessing my teenage self and like the insecurities that came with the overriding cultural cachet of the time. And Winona Ryder was the beauty standard, and that's, it's exciting to see yourself to like graft yourself onto Lainey, but it's also like you'll never be that beautiful, so you're never going to be beautiful, so you'll never get dumped by a total douchebag, so I guess you're going to die alone.
Just some uncomfortable feelings that you may not want to open the closet on. Yeah, I can see that. Janine Garofalo, though, is like, I always like, she's always kind of like relegated to the bit part, to the sidekick, to like the supporting character. But she's both like legitimately, to me at least, like beautiful and also just wildly funny and weird and charismatic and magnetic. And I love her. I don't like, she never, except for like that movie about dogs that I always forget the title of.
The Truth About Cats and Dogs.
Something. Yeah, there you go.
Which is
our title.
Beautifully casted. Like, how did they get such a great cast for such a terrible script movie?
Yeah, I like that film because of her.
Yeah,
though, because I think it's a testament to like what she can do for a film, and I think maybe part of that like low key chauvinism of the 90s is they could never figure out, like, people could never figure out what to do with her.
Well, that she's cast in that movie as the ugly duckling is wild because she's beautiful. It makes no fucking sense. It just is like shorthand for if you're not super aiming for the male gaze and doing whatever to please men,
right?
You're not beautiful. You're not super desirable.
I still quote her from The Cable Guy.
Oh, Well, I mean, this is the era where Janine and Ben Stiller were besties. So that's how she ended up in this movie. And I think this movie is all the luckier to have her and her weird 70s obsession.
But she has the most depth, I think, in the whole film.
Yeah, the vulnerability of having an AIDS scare is real, or trying to live out your sexual liberation when people want women to not be liberated. That's all really real.
And having Winona talk down to you, like, I don't want your part-time job at the Gap because I've got this dream of mine.
That was fucked up. I was like, you and Ethan Hawke deserve each other in this moment, because that was really fucked up.
And also, when you're so much cooler than your friend and they say some stuff like that to you, it's like, excuse me, what? Okay. I pay most of the rent here, so why don't you calm down?
Gotta call you out on your $400 psychic bill.
Oh my gosh, that was also an amazing moment. So these 900 numbers in the 90s, so real. One year they were all on MTV, like they were all advertised on MTV. And I called several of them with my cousins at our grandparents' house. And for my birthday, I got a birthday card with a phone bill inside of it that he'd written paid on it. And he was like, that's what you get though this year. This is like $200 worth of calls.
Do you remember which one you called? Was it Latoya? Was it?
It wasn't psychics. It was like the New Kids on the Block hotline. And there were a bunch of bands that had these 900 numbers aimed at kids, which seems like such a scam.
Mm-hmm. That's so scammy. That would never be like,
that would not be allowed now.
So wait, so what happened when you called the New Kids hotline? Like,
you just hear a recorded message. So it wasn't worth it. It was very expensive to not talk to anybody.
Yeah, don't like that.
Yeah.
Murder Knight's going to talk to me for real if I call the hotline.
There was a Simpsons episode about it.
Oh, really?
Where there's like this pop star named Corey and like Lisa gets addicted to it, but it's just recording.
Yeah.
There's a Simpsons episode for everything.
Yeah.
Truly.
And now kids just have social media and they can desperately comment and hope that Justin Bieber writes back to them or whatever they're doing now.
Or Justin Bieber's social media manager.
Yeah.
I liked your post.
Well, there are stars that do look at this stuff. Like Taylor Swift is aware of who her biggest fans are and she definitely follows what they do online. Rihanna, same thing. Like these people truly, they don't respond necessarily themselves, but they are looking and they are seeing. Only a few. So what do we feel like the legacy of the Reality Bites soundtrack is? I mean, it's not coolness. This is not a cool soundtrack. I think it's interesting that it's not a grunge soundtrack. Like it's not singles. It's very indie rock. There's some strong indie rock things that made it to the actual album soundtrack, but there's also like Dinosaur Jr. and other really good stuff that gets played in the movie, as well as really corporate stuff.
Dinosaur Jr. is like the closest this gets to grunge.
Right.
Yeah. I think, and then with Lisa Loeb being the big single, like that is not cool. It was an interesting story and it always has been and it still is, but I don't like, there's no cachet to that. So I think I've read a lot of retrospective pieces coming into this, and there's a lot of critique about the good and the bad of this soundtrack and picking apart how it doesn't make sense. I think people wanted 90s soundtracks to continue to be like John Hughes soundtracks, where they're really soundtracks that are reflective of one person's music taste. And that's more cohesive and somehow cooler and less commercial. That's the thing about all these Clueless, Reality Bites, all of it. It feels weirdly commercial, but like misses the mark.
Yeah, it's not quite on the same level as like singles, where it's like kind of more like of an artistic vision.
Yeah.
And maybe that is the legacy of the soundtrack and the movie itself, is that it's more trying to be this window into representation of people's everyday lives and struggles. It's not trying to be something slick or commercial. And in that way, it still does feel really 90s, even if it doesn't include a bunch of stuff that is strictly of the time. Even when it's not of its time, it still feels kind of like a preserved artifact because of the whole 70s, 90s kind of backwards looking connection, because each of these songs feels connected to these very kind of like everyday characters. I think that it maybe gave filmmakers more license to do that, to try that, instead of trying to create something that was, you know, a blockbuster soundtrack in itself.
I feel like this soundtrack is really representative of the musical legacy of the 90s, because in the 80s we had college rock and college radio, and there was a definitive underground, but at the same time, like the biggest bands from that underground were on IRS Records, which was not, it was an indie label, but it was not a small label. Like the brother of Sting or the brother of Stuart Copeland, Miles Copeland, ran the label. So it wasn't like they didn't have a ton of money and they had to deal with MCA, but it was like the bar for what selling out was just different, like messier. And then the selling out idea becomes really solidified in the 90s. But mainstream alternative rock transitions from being modern rock to alternative and becomes very corporate because it's mainstream. Like it's the biggest, rock radio is the biggest and most influential thing going in the 90s until the end of the decade when it turns into an utter shit show. And then in the 2000s, the pendulum swings again, and it becomes very in vogue to invoke this indie sound that started out as like Strokes, White Stripes, yeahs, and then really quickly becomes softer, more Death Cab and Beach House and things of that ilk. And it is a grouping. Like there are people that are in that scene, but it's also just a sound that can be grafted onto so many different movies and TV shows. And that sort of solidifying thing doesn't exist in the 90s other than inside of grunge. So, but music in the 90s is so much more than grunge. So I don't know. I think it's just like this soundtrack is as messy as music was in the 90s. It wasn't one thing. It's not a monolith.
It's messy just like the characters' lives.
Just like Troy's hair.
Troy's greasy hair.
Artfully messy.
Well, thank you, Courtney, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I mean, I love this movie and I really enjoyed talking about it with you both.
I enjoyed not hating the movie and making our guest uncomfortable.
It was a welcome change. Yeah, no, this was very good.
Have you guys had multiple, is it really just Beautiful Girls, or have you had multiple instances of that happening lately?
We will disagree amongst ourselves sometimes, and that happens, and we're used to that, but we're friends, so that's different. Disagreeing with your friend is on a completely different plane than disagreeing with your guest, because it's like somebody walking into your house, and you're like, your bit sucks. Get out.
Yeah, true.
Brought the wrong beer. Bye. So that it just felt very uncomfortable, and we were very apologetic, but also very firm that the whole Natalie Portman thing was not cool.
Yeah. Well, then I'm very happy I picked something that didn't make it awkward for an hour plus.
So where can people find Songs My Experience?
Yeah, you can find it anywhere you get podcasts, everywhere you get podcasts. And we have a website at nevermind.fm where you can check out our bookshop.org store, where we put all of the things our guests talk about on, and transcripts of the show and links to random things that are tangentially related to each episode.
Very cool. And as far as social media, how can people find you?
Well, I mean, after this, if you still really want to, I'm the Courtney E Smith on a lot of platforms. And if you don't find that, well, it wasn't meant to be.
And you can find us on Twitter, or we're still going to call it Twitter, at soundtrack_your and soundtrackcast on Instagram. And if you want to hear about Sing 2's plot told by our wonderful Nicole Barlow. That is on our Patreon at patreon.com/soundtrack.
I personally will be joining to hear that. Wow.
Well, thanks again, Courtney. It's a pleasure speaking with you. Jen Howell has good taste because she recommended you and you did not disappoint.
Well, everyone should have the good taste to listen to the Every Rom-Com Ever podcast. It's great. And this one was my favorite now, though. Sorry, Jen.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.